the golden light of a quiet morning, Élise walked through the lavender fields with a wicker basket resting on her arm. The sweet scent of the flowers mingled with the distant sound of the small church bells, marking the beginning of another day in the village. The fields of Provence, painted in shades of purple and green, offered a silent beauty, one that didn't need an audience to exist. Since childhood, Élise had known every trail between the hills, every tree that stood firm against the wind, every loose stone along the path. She had grown up on that land like the lavenders themselves, strong, discreet, and imbued with a quiet inner strength. She cared for her grandmother with the same tenderness she used to pick flowers. The elderly woman, her hair as white as the linen hanging in the windows, spent her days sitting near the wood-burning stove, embroidering stories that faded with time. Élise prepared teas, natural remedies, steaming broths for the late afternoons. Life was simple, but full of small rituals that kept the heart warm even during the harshest winters. The house where they lived was hidden behind a wall covered in vines and jasmine. The windows were always open, letting the air flow through like a welcome visitor. Everything there radiated peace, even the sadness that from time to time came knocking. In recent months, her grandmother's health had started to decline. First came the dizziness, then the fatigue after climbing the few steps to the porch. Still, she never complained. She kept a serene gaze and the smile of someone who knew time was beginning to say goodbye. Élise stayed by her side with the devotion of someone who understood the value of each moment. She sewed sheets, picked herbs, read aloud to fill the silence. She watched the sunset with tear-filled eyes, but never said a word about the fear she felt. The two shared a bond that needed no explanations. When night fell, Élise lit candles, carefully locked the doors, and slept on the mattress beside her grandmother's bed, listening to her breathing like a prayer. One morning, the scent of lavender seemed heavier, as if the fields were trying to comfort something that hadn't yet been spoken. Her grandmother didn't wake up. She passed in silence, with the same gentleness she had lived. There were no screams or despair, only warm tears streaming down Elise's face as she held the hand of the woman who represented everything she knew about love, security, and roots. The entire village paid their respects. The church ladies came in procession, singing old hymns, bringing flowers and fresh bread. It was a slow day, where time seemed to bow before the void. Élise walked through the empty house as if every corner still echoed her grandmother's presence. The linen remained folded on the armchair. The kettle stayed in the same spot, but everything had changed. For the first time, the silence in the house felt heavier than it did comforting. There was no one left to make tea for, no reason to pick the flowers. The land that had always felt so alive now seemed to ask for a farewell. For a few days, Élise withdrew. She didn't cry in front of anyone. She cleaned the house, gave away her grandmother's belongings to the closest neighbors, and prayed silently at the chapel's altar. Then, she sat by the window and stared out at the fields. The world felt bigger and emptier. Her grandmother's absence wasn't just physical. It was as if Élise herself had lost a part of who she was. It was in that emptiness that the impulse to leave was born. For the first time, the thought of leaving the village didn't feel like an escape, but a way to keep living. She knew, without anyone having to tell her, that her time there had come to an end. In a simple dress and braided hair, she went to the small community office where job and housing notices were posted. She found a discreet ad, written in formal French, looking for a nanny with experience in childcare for a foreign family. Without hesitation, she wrote down the number. She didn't know where she was going, or who would be waiting. She just felt she had to go. And so, the girl from the lavender fields began the hardest goodbye of her life. Still mourning, but with a calm determination in her movements, Élise packed her suitcase with only a few belongings. Some of her grandmother's books, a dress she had sewn herself, old letters kept in a wooden box, and a small bottle of lavender oil. The suitcase, though light, carried the story of an entire life. She left the house key with the closest neighbor and walked to the bus stop that would take her to the city. The village faded into the curves of the road, dissolving into the mist rising from the fields. She didn't look back. She knew that while the memories would last forever, time demanded movement. In Aix-en-Provence, she was received by the agency with a formality that was almost cold but efficient. But a middle-aged woman with thin glasses reviewed her resume with discretion and, after a few questions, offered her a unique opportunity. An Austrian businessman urgently needed a new nanny for his daughter. The job required an immediate move to a distant country, harsh weather, complete discretion, and experience with children. Élise listened carefully and accepted without hesitation. She understood this wasn't just a job, it was a new beginning. Meanwhile, far from the warmth of southern France, in the snow-covered silent Austrian Alps, Julian Falk endured yet another winter within the walls of the mansion he had chosen to live in after his wife's death. The estate, isolated in the Engadin Valley, stood with an austere elegance. Dark stone columns, tall windows that barely opened, fireplaces always lit, but never warming the demeanor of the house's owner. Julian woke every morning at 6, read reports from the hotel chain he managed, answered emails with surgical precision, and joined virtual meetings where he rarely raised his voice. His routine followed a military discipline. He lunched alone, reviewed investments, checked on the progress of renovations in various properties of the group. Everything was controlled, efficient, flawless, except for what mattered most. Since his wife's death, Annalena had locked herself in her own world. The 6-year-old girl, once smiling in front of social column cameras, now barely spoke. She slept little, had frequent nightmares, and rejected every nanny her father hired. All attempts had failed. None of them stayed longer than 2 weeks. Some gave up before even unpacking. The atmosphere in the house, as cold as the snow that constantly fell over the valley, repelled any trace of warmth. Julian knew he had lost something beyond his wife. He had also lost the bond with his daughter. He tried to compensate for that absence with expensive gifts, imported toys, and rooms decorated with meticulous perfection. None of it worked. Annalena remained distant. She preferred to hide under the covers or sit silently by the window, watching the snowflakes fall as if they were voices she could no longer hear. Karl Weiss, his longtime friend and advisor, watched everything with a silent but attentive gaze. He had known Julian since their college days, understood what he was capable of in the business world, but also recognized the vulnerabilities Julian refused to admit. It was Karl who subtly suggested that perhaps what Annalena needed wasn't more comfort, but someone who knew how to listen without rushing, to touch without fear, and to embrace without the intention of control. Julian resisted the idea at first, believing discipline was the only way to maintain order. But when he saw his daughter refuse even breakfast, he understood the time for hesitation had passed. The decision to seek a new nanny was made with the same precision he used to sign multi-million-dollar contracts. He sent a request to the agency in Aix-en-Provence with precise specifications. The professional had to be discreet, experienced in sensitive environments, with no prior ties to the press or social circles. He wanted someone outside the norm, someone uninterested in the Falk name or what it represented. He wanted silence, efficiency, and a lack of complications. The reply came in 2 days. A young Frenchwoman with no ambitions for social advancement, from a remote village, with solid references and no connections to the corporate world. Elise's name appeared on his computer screen like a dissonant note in his routine. He examined her profile with skepticism, but something in her eyes in the photo, perhaps the way she faced the camera without posing or trying to please, made him accept the recommendation. The interview was deemed unnecessary. The contract was drawn up, the ticket sent, the room prepared with simplicity and neutrality. She would arrive in 2 days. Meanwhile, Élise stepped off the train in Austria, wrapped in a coat loaned to her by the agency's representative. The snow under her feet crunched as if announcing her arrival. She looked around with calm resolve, unhurried, but without hesitation. A driver awaited her with a discreet sign. She got into the car, watching the landscape transform into a monochromatic painting. Snow-covered hills, bare trees, and in the distance, the imposing silhouette of the mansion where she would spend the coming months, perhaps years. She didn't know what awaited her, but she wasn't afraid. Inside her was a recent grief, but also an old courage, the kind of strength born from quiet care, from solitude faced without armor, from tenderness built day after day beside someone you love. The road stretched ahead, winding between white valleys and dull skies, and even though she didn't know it yet, the fate awaiting her in that frozen mansion wouldn't be just a new job. It would be the starting point of a transformation that would touch everyone there, including the man who, for now, remained locked within his own pride. Elise's arrival in the Engadin Valley coincided with the start of a snowstorm that covered the entire landscape within minutes. turning the roads into long corridors of pure white. When the car finally passed through the estate's gates, she was met with the mansion's silent immensity. The dark stone walls, partially covered by dry ivy and built-up ice, exuded a presence far removed from any notion of warmth. The closed windows reflected the gray sky, and the only sound was the faint crunch of snow beneath the car tires. The driver opened the door, and Élise stepped out with steady steps, carrying only her small raw fabric suitcase and a coat slightly too big for her frame. The main door was opened by a housekeeper, who led her down a wide, dark hallway without saying a word, where portraits in gilded frames watched in silence. Just ahead, Julian waited, standing without a smile, his hands clasped behind his back, and his eyes fixed on an undefined point between her and the floor. There was something elegant in his posture, but also a rigidity that kept any affection at a distance. The welcome was brief, formal, and devoid of any gesture of hospitality. Élise responded with a slight nod and followed the housekeeper to the room assigned to her. The space was neutral, clean, functional, with no signs of emotional comfort. There was a simple bed, an empty wardrobe, and a small desk by the window. The silence was so deep, she could hear her own heartbeat. The next day, the routine began without warning. Élise came down the stairs at 7 a.m. and went to the east wing of the mansion, where Annalina's room was located. The housekeeper merely pointed to the door with a curt gesture before disappearing down a side corridor. The girl, seated by the window, didn't turn at the sound of footsteps. She remained still, hugging a slightly worn stuffed bear, staring out at the lifeless white landscape. Élise introduced herself gently, keeping her distance, but Annalina didn't react. In the first few days, that distance turned into an invisible wall. The girl rejected all attempts at closeness. She ignored questions, pushed away the books Élise offered, refused the lovingly prepared meals, and stayed silent during walks in the frozen garden. Julian, for his part, limited himself to watching from afar. He greeted Élise with restrained nods, avoided long conversations, and remained focused on his professional obligations. The atmosphere in the house seemed to mirror his coldness. The hallways were dark, the furniture perfectly aligned but lifeless. There were artificial flowers in the vases and paintings that seemed never to have been chosen by anyone with emotion. Everything there functioned like a well-oiled machine, but one without a soul. Despite the resistance, Élise did not back down. She spent the mornings by the window, in the same space where Annalina hid in her silence. She didn't force conversation, just shared time. She read story passages in a soft voice, spoke of the flowers in Provence, of the colors of the fields in spring, of the smell of her grandmother's bread, and the songs she heard in the local church. Sometimes she took the girl out to the garden, even in the snow, and began small rituals, planting seeds that might never sprout, clearing the greenhouse bed, hanging wind chimes made of twigs and string. Slowly, these gestures, though initially ignored, began to create a new atmosphere. Annalina still didn't speak, but she started to follow Élise with her eyes. One late afternoon, the girl followed her to the greenhouse without being called. She sat on a bench and watched in silence as Élise gently worked the frozen soil. The connection was born there, silent, fragile, but real. In the days that followed, small signs of progress became visible. Annalina agreed to eat beside Élise. Then, she held a colored pencil, while the Frenchwoman drew imaginary landscapes inspired by the stories she told. One morning, she allowed Élise to braid her hair. Another day, she offered her a dried flower she had found between the pages of the old library books. Julian watched all of this with a mix of astonishment and caution. He couldn't understand how someone could so naturally enter spaces he himself could not reach. He felt out of place in his own home, as if everything were changing without him having any control. Still, he didn't interfere. He continued his routine with precision, but now paused for long moments at the greenhouse windows, watching his daughter and the nanny, as if witnessing a performance he didn't understand, but didn't want to interrupt. Élise maintained her gentle and steady demeanor. She didn't question, didn't push. She simply offered her presence. The mansion, once silent and impersonal, began to show signs of change. The housekeeper started placing fresh flowers in the vases, something she hadn't done in years. The hallways were filled with subtle aromas from the infusions Élise prepared with dried herbs. The library, once kept locked, was opened so Annalena could choose her own books. A barely noticeable lightness settled into the spaces. There were no grand gestures, no revolutions, just the delicate constancy of a woman who carried within her the rhythm of the countryside, the wisdom of simple things, and the patience of someone who had learned that time, when respected, heals even the deepest wounds. And so, in that almost imperceptible rhythm, the child's heart began to beat with more confidence. The nightmares lessened. The nights became less endless. Annalena began to draw again, still in silence, but with lines that revealed new feelings. Colorful houses, flowers, trees, hands held together. When Julian saw one of these drawings left on the table, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't just surprise. It was a sudden discomfort, as if something inside him wanted to move but was still trapped beneath layers of pain and control. Even so, he allowed himself to stay there, standing, staring at the paper for long minutes, trying to understand how those soft colors had made it through the walls he himself had built. As the days passed, the subtle transformation that had begun inside the house started to reach the silent depths of Annalena. The girl who had once withdrawn into silence like a closed shell began to show small signs of change that, although discreet, carried a timid hope. At night, she started falling asleep more easily, without needing the housekeeper's constant presence or the light on in the room. The nightmares that once woke her in frequent fright began to fade, and her eyes rested more peacefully during the long hours of the night. In the morning, her face showed less tension. The once avoidant gaze, marked by fear, gradually found comfort in the constant presence of Élise, who never demanded urgency or answers, but offered the steady safety of someone who understands another's fragility. Within this new rhythm, the girl approached the world of colors and shapes. One afternoon, after a brief walk through the garden partially covered in snow, Annalena stopped in front of the table, where Élise was arranging her stationery, and sat down in silence. She picked up a colored pencil and began to draw, first with shy, hesitant lines, as if afraid to step into unfamiliar territory. Then, she grew more confident. On the paper, images appeared that broke away from the mansion's grayness. Flowers, stars, small houses surrounded by trees, and female figures in long dresses, many of them holding hands with children. Without saying anything, she handed the drawing to Élise and slowly walked down the hallway. The nanny remained there for a few moments, observing the delicacy of the lines and realizing, without needing words, that trust was beginning to bloom like a seed protected by winter. That gesture marked the beginning of a new phase. Annalena began drawing every day. She carried sketch pads, scattered pencils across her desk, and created little illustrated stories that revealed her inner world with touching honesty. Many of the images had recurring elements: butterflies, flowered hills, lit fireplaces, and almost always a figure with brown hair tied with a ribbon, a soft, affectionate representation of Élise. This new routine not only strengthened the bond between them, but also filled the mansion with a different energy. The housekeeper, once stern, began leaving a small plate of cookies in the corner of the room where Annalena drew. One of the gardeners offered an old clipboard to make it easier for her to draw outdoors. Even Julian, still trapped in his own world of rigidity, began to notice that something inside the house had changed, not with noise, but with harmony. During this time, Élise maintained her careful posture. At no point did she try to rush the process of getting closer. She continued to work with consistency and dedication, respecting the girl's silences, quietly celebrating each breakthrough, never turning anything born of spontaneity into a performance. Sometimes, while Annalena drew, she would prepare infusions with dried herbs and let the aroma fill the room. On other occasions, she read softly while the girl colored with focus. This quiet coexistence built a deep bond between them, based not on words, but on the sharing of time, space, and care. The atmosphere in the house, once cold and impersonal, began to mold itself to the rhythm of that connection, opening space for new forms of presence to take root. Julian, in turn, began to notice that Elise's presence wasn't limited to his daughter's well-being. There was something about the way she occupied the spaces that affected everyone. She didn't impose change, but inspired it with her constancy. She paid attention to small details, the arrangement of cushions, the care with the flowers, the way she folded napkins. These seemingly trivial actions restored a sense of humanity to the space. The millionaire watched from a distance, like someone witnessing a transformation he didn't fully understand, but recognized as necessary. He still didn't know how to deal with his own emotions, nor with the feeling that something inside him also needed to be rebuilt. However, even without admitting it, he had already started to look forward to the late afternoons, when, returning from the office, he would find his daughter drawing and the nanny reading by the fireplace, as if that moment were a portrait of everything he had lost, or perhaps something he had never known he could have. This new routine stretched on for weeks, solidifying an emotional dynamic that brought color back into the heart of the house. Annalena began sleeping alone without resistance. She started smiling more often, eating with more appetite, showing curiosity for the stories Élise told. Sometimes, she would leave little notes with drawings around the house, a silent way of expressing gratitude or sharing what she felt. One morning, she drew 3 figures holding hands: a child, a woman in a long dress, and a man in a suit, all walking through a flower-filled field. When Julian found the paper on his office desk, he was thrown off. He stood still for several minutes, as if the image had broken something inside him that had long remained sealed. He didn't comment to anyone but tucked the drawing into a drawer and spent more time that night standing by his bedroom window, watching the snow fall in silence. The mansion, once marked by thick, impenetrable silence, began to experience lighter pauses, small breaths that appeared almost imperceptibly, as if Élise's presence had altered not just Annalena's routine, but also the atmosphere of the space. After the girl found refuge in her drawings and safety in the company of her caregiver, the tension that had ruled over the adults began to ease. Julian, who had maintained a reserved and professional stance toward the new employee, began to notice the subtle gestures she made throughout the days. He realized, for instance, that she arranged the books in the library not alphabetically, but by theme and emotion. Heavier stories sat on the lower shelves. Lighter books and romances were placed closer to the window, as if to soak up sunlight. This detail, though subtle, caught his attention and stirred a quiet curiosity about the way this young Frenchwoman viewed the world. These small observations, though seemingly minor, began to shape Julian's behavior almost unintentionally. At the breakfast table, once occupied only by him and the housekeeper, where the clinking of silverware reigned, Élise's presence became more frequent, especially on days of heavy snow when outside commitments were few. She would sit with discretion, waiting for the unspoken invitation of routine. On those occasions, there were no formal speeches, just a slightly warmer atmosphere where exchanges were punctuated by comfortable silences. Julian began to ask, without hurry, about the books she read or customs from the south of France. At times, he found himself surprised to hear stories of her childhood among the lavender fields, or the songs her grandmother had taught her. These were not deep conversations, but fragments that, when pieced together, formed a bridge between 2 worlds that had once seemed incompatible. In the hallways of the house, where footsteps echoed against austere walls, Élise began to cross paths with Julian more frequently. Before, he avoided getting close, hidden behind his armor of control. Now, though still reserved, there was a certain softening in him. He began making small gestures that, in another context, might have gone unnoticed, offering her an umbrella on a windy day, holding the door politely when he saw her approaching with Annalena's toys in her arms, bringing her a cup of hot tea one morning when she looked particularly tired. Each of these actions carried no grand declarations, but revealed a quiet effort on his part to come closer in a way that didn't betray his own guarded nature. The clearest turning point came one cold afternoon, when Élise, while organizing the library, found a French novel forgotten among volumes in German and English. It was an old romance from Julian's youth, which he had read during a season in Geneva. When he noticed she recognized the author, he briefly commented that he appreciated the narrative's direct and melancholic style. From that moment, a series of casual meetings in the library took shape, not scheduled, but born of silent affinity. While Élise read softly by the window, Julian pretended to work, but listened closely to her tone and pauses. In those moments, time seemed suspended, and the mansion, blanketed in snow, became almost a refuge made of paper and words. As the weeks passed, small laughs began to appear in unexpected situations. One Saturday morning, when they ran out of coffee and only a mint infusion prepared by Élise remained, Julian tasted the drink hesitantly, made a subtle grimace, and noticing her amused glance, responded with a dry but witty comment that drew a spontaneous laugh from her. It was the first time he had laughed in a long time, even if just slightly. These moments repeated in nuances. A joke about the drawings scattered around the room, a remark about her French accent when pronouncing Austrian names, an observation shared about the curious behavior of a squirrel that often appeared outside the second-floor window. They weren't bursts of laughter, but moments of complicity that broke through the rigid, formally programmed environment Julian had built his life around. With every new interaction, Élise maintained her light and respectful posture. She didn't try to figure him out, nor did she try to insert herself more than necessary. Her demeanor was that of someone who understood the other's boundaries, yet still offered a constant and welcoming presence. That delicacy, perhaps, was what most disarmed Julian. Accustomed to controlling negotiations, teams, and corporate decisions, he now found himself facing someone who didn't demand, didn't pressure, and didn't judge, yet still deeply altered the way he experienced daily life. And in that discomfort, something began to shift within him. At night, while reviewing documents or writing reports, his mind often drifted to images from the day: Elise's brief laughter, the sound of pages turning in the library, the soft voice reading children's stories with a tenderness he no longer remembered hearing before. At the same time, the impact of these changes began to show in practical choices. Julian started adjusting his schedule to arrive at the mansion earlier, extended previously brief lunches just to walk through the garden and observe, from a distance, the interaction between Élise and Annalena. He asked the housekeeper to include a specific kind of French bread at breakfast, after hearing Élise mention it with nostalgia in a casual conversation. He ordered books in French without saying a word, simply leaving them on the library table. These gestures, though small, represented important concessions for someone who had spent years isolating himself in a routine governed by goals and grief. This phase of their shared daily life solidified a particular atmosphere, where words were no longer necessary to signal closeness. The other's presence was felt not in the absence of conflict, but in the frequency of those filled silences, moments where two people shared the same space without needing to explain themselves. Julian began to discover, without fully realizing it, that there was life beyond the walls of the empire he had built, and that life pulsed in delicate gestures, in unexpected laughter, and in glances exchanged between books, coffee, and snowy landscapes. Elise's presence in the mansion, though discreet and marked by a respectful reserve, was no longer just part of the routine. It had become an emotional anchor that Julian couldn't name at first. As the days moved forward under the blanket of snow, the businessman realized that when she was nearby, the atmosphere seemed to breathe differently. There was no exact reason, no grand gesture, no disruption to the order of things. But in every one of her movements, there was a lightness that slowly relieved the weight he carried inside. He felt it in the mornings when Annalena's laughter echoed through the hallway, as Élise accompanied her to the garden. In the afternoons when he walked past the library and noticed the light on, the soft sound of pages turning, or the faint aroma of tea drifting through the door crack. Though he wouldn't admit it even to himself, he started to look forward to those small presences with more anticipation than he wanted to. Just hearing her voice, even in simple sentences, or while reading stories, was enough to break his concentration. He tried to attribute the feeling to gratitude. After all, since Élise had entered his daughter's life, the girl had smiled more, slept better, and slowly reopened to the world. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just that. The restlessness he felt while watching her was different from professional admiration. There was a new warmth, an almost physical discomfort when he noticed the gentle way she adjusted her hair, or the sleeves of her coat, the way she walked through the garden, the light in her eyes when she spoke of something she loved. All of it stirred something in him in a way that was unexpected and dangerous. Julian fought against this feeling with the same discipline he applied to business. He avoided prolonging conversations. He started having lunch out more often under the pretext of meetings. He tried to occupy himself with short trips to Vienna and virtual meetings at night, all in an attempt to impose a safe distance between himself and the woman who, little by little, was beginning to occupy not just a physical space in the mansion, but an emotional one in a territory he believed had lain dormant since his wife's death. Guilt accompanied him in silence. He considered it unacceptable to allow any other woman to awaken in him, something even remotely close to what he once felt for Clara. And what seemed even worse was the fact that this woman was his daughter's caregiver, someone he had hired to fulfill a specific role, and who now, without intention or artifice, was unraveling with simple gestures everything he had spent years hardening. On days when he felt most vulnerable, Julian withdrew to his office, reviewing reports with unnecessary rigor, just to keep his mind busy. Yet all it took was the sound of Élise's laughter from the kitchen, or her footsteps crossing the hallway for his concentration to dissolve. At times, he found himself watching her through the window as she organized Annalina's toys in the garden or picked small wildflowers along the edges of the greenhouse. In those moments, he felt an unexpected tenderness, coupled with an urgent need to retreat. It was clear he had crossed a silent boundary within himself, and that, if he didn't step back, something might change irreversibly. He scolded himself for it, convinced that this feeling was inappropriate, ill-timed, and incompatible with the lifestyle he had chosen after his grief. Élise, for her part, remained unaware of the internal storm growing inside him. She continued with her dedicated posture, attentive to the details of the house, affectionate with Annalina, and respectful of Julian's personal space. Perhaps, on some level, she sensed something different in certain glances, in some of the longer silences, but she gave no sign of seeking any kind of closeness beyond what was necessary. Her impeccable conduct only intensified Julian's conflict, as there was no attempt at seduction or charm in her. On the contrary, it was her naturalness that most disarmed him. There were no masks, and precisely because of that, she was impossible to ignore. The absence of games, vanity, or ambition turned each of her gestures into something authentic, and that authenticity struck at his defenses with unrelenting precision. One night, while reviewing documents in the lounge, Julian let slip that an old French song playing quietly on the radio brought back memories of his youth. Realizing he had made the comment unintentionally, without meaning to, he abruptly stood up and ended the evening earlier than usual. He was irritated with himself for allowing a crack to show. Any demonstration of affection, no matter how small, made him feel exposed, vulnerable, and out of control. In the days that followed, he returned to a colder posture, limiting his interactions with Élise to the essentials. But contrary to what he expected, that distance only fed the internal conflict. The more he tried to silence what he felt, the stronger those feelings grew in the absence. Julian understood that it wasn't just about desire or loneliness. It was something deeper. Élise represented a possibility he no longer believed was real. A life in which emotions weren't a risk, but a bridge. A life where it wouldn't be necessary to live between the rigidity of contracts and the emptiness of silent halls. However, that vision still felt too distant to embrace. So he continued suppressing everything that quietly grew inside him, convinced that protecting the order of things was safer than facing the consequences of a misplaced emotion. And so, even when their eyes met by chance, even when their fingers brushed briefly while exchanging a book or a cup, Julian kept his facade intact, pretending nothing had changed, even though, inside, everything was changing. In the days that followed, the silent tension Julian wrestled with internally began to coexist with a whirlwind of feelings he still barely understood. Élise's constant presence around his daughter, the gentle gestures she offered even during the most routine moments, and the ease with which she carried herself throughout the mansion, made him realize something in his world had shifted. It was no longer just about how efficiently she cared for Annalina, or the calm she brought to the house. There was a lightness in the way she looked out the wide windows toward the horizon, a sincerity in her restrained smile when she crossed paths with him in the hallways, or sat at the table during quiet family lunches. Every subtle detail, every silent pause between one conversation and the next, sparked feelings in him that he hadn't experienced in many years. Still, he remained restrained, carefully cold in his reactions, as if aware of the chasm between emotion and the permission his mind demanded. And as he struggled to control this internal conflict, a letter arrived at the mansion's office, sent directly from Prague. It was an invitation to a charity ball organized by one of the capital's cultural foundations, a traditional event gathering diplomats, businessmen, aristocrats, and members of the European elite for a night of donations, speeches, and status displays. Julian, who in previous years had always attended alongside his late wife, had yet to return to major social events since her passing. His absence had fueled speculation for months, but now there was an expectation that he would return to the public scene. Carl, always attuned to the world around them, suggested that this might be the perfect moment for a comeback. Julian, though reluctant, agreed to attend. However, when he considered his options for company, he couldn't find anyone among the usual names who genuinely represented something meaningful at that moment. He thought of Élise, her natural discretion, her always calm demeanor, even amid the pomp that sometimes overtook the mansion. He knew that taking her would risk drawing attention to something he himself didn't fully understand. Even so, he decided to invite her, not to spark scandal, but because deep down, he wanted her near during a moment that would demand so much of his emotional strength. Julian's decision did not go unnoticed by the household staff, nor by Carl, who sensed in the gesture something deeper than a mere desire to make a good public impression. When Élise appeared in the main hall, ready to leave, wearing a sober and elegant dress that the housekeeper had carefully selected, the impact was immediate. There was no exaggeration in her appearance, just a quiet beauty that reflected her essence. Upon arriving in Prague, the setting changed completely. The illuminated halls, the sound of clinking glasses, orchestras playing waltzes, and the keen eyes of guests accustomed to reading between the lines of appearances and attitudes. It didn't take long for Elise's presence at Julian's side to spark reactions masked by calculated smiles and low whispers. Though her introduction hadn't been formal, their closeness caught attention. Some familiar faces greeted him with respect, but with the kind of smile that hints at restrained judgment. In the following hours, the press, which discreetly covered the event, captured images of the couple. Photos of Élise beside the magnate began circulating, accompanied by suggestive remarks about her background, her youth, and especially her supposed incompatibility with elite society. It didn't take long before sensationalist morning newspapers splashed provocative headlines, exploiting the contrast between the Austrian businessman and the country nanny, as they began calling her. What for Julian had been a natural and discreet gesture became fuel for speculation and public scrutiny. Élise, even without reacting directly, felt the weight of the collective gaze, of the veiled criticism that cruelly tried to reduce her to a stereotype. Her memories of that night didn't linger on the details of the ballroom or the music playing, but on the discomfort of feeling watched, judged, and interpreted by an audience that neither knew her story nor her worth. Julian, meanwhile, still battling his inner conflict, maintained an impassive posture in the face of comments, but he couldn't stop the unrest from creeping into his thoughts, as he saw the impact his decision had on Élise. The fragility of the situation exposed not only the prejudices of the circle he belonged to, but also the rigidity with which he had been dealing with his own emotions. That night, which was supposed to mark a simple return to his social life, turned out to be a turning point between the image he projected and the truth beginning to emerge in his heart. And even though no explicit gesture had been made, it was evident that something had changed. The scandal that formed behind the scenes wasn't just about the boldness of bringing a nanny to a gala, but about the collective fear that someone so different could occupy a space that once belonged to expected perfection, and was now threatened by something far more human and real. The aftermath of the ball continued to spread rapidly in the days that followed, fueled by the media's growing interest in Élise's name. The photographs taken at the event, showing her beside Julian amid the opulence of Prague's ballrooms, circulated through society columns, gossip websites, and business speculation networks. Initially, most headlines took on a suggestive tone, playing up the contrast between the magnate's refined image and his companion's discreet simplicity. However, as the days passed and newspapers noticed that the public's curiosity was turning into fascination, and, in some cases, veiled disdain, the coverage grew more aggressive and personal. Journalists scoured immigration records, domestic worker databases, and old social media profiles until they uncovered concrete information about Élise's past. They published that she had grown up in a rural village in southern France, had worked since adolescence to help care for her sick grandmother, and lived off small jobs tied to local farming. They dug up her registration with a caregiver and nanny agency, ironically highlighting the section where she wrote that she liked children, flowers, and the silence of the mornings. The most sensationalist newspapers took it further. They began calling her the Alpine peasant, the elite's laundress, and even the intruder of the ice castle, referring to Julian's mansion in the Engadin Valley. The press twisted her story into a distorted fairy tale, where innocence was dismissed, simplicity was treated as ignorance, and her closeness to Julian was interpreted with malice and suspicion. Photographs of her old home, the modest property where she once grew lavender with her grandmother, were plastered across double-page spreads, accompanied by cruel captions about her being far too humble for the golden halls of Central Europe. Derogatory comments infiltrated opinion columns, and even talk shows began debating whether a man like Julian Falk should compromise his image for a sentimental whim with someone so far beneath his social rank. Articles questioned her education, hinted that her presence was part of an opportunistic strategy, and fed into prejudice with a quiet ferocity, the kind that comes from a pen sharpened behind the veneer of journalism. The impact of it all was devastating. Élise, already bearing the weight of adapting to an environment so far removed from her roots, now also carried the pain of seeing her life turned into a target for public ridicule. It wasn't the exposure itself that hurt the most, but the way every fragment of her life was distorted to feed someone else's judgment. Familiar faces in the mansion began acting with forced caution, as if silence was the only way to avoid taking sides. The routine lost its natural rhythm. In the hallways, curious looks turned calculated. On walks with Annalena, she noticed photographers more frequently hiding behind cars and bushes, trying to capture anything that could confirm the fabricated narratives. Even the French press, which had previously ignored her existence, began mentioning her as a symbol of a supposedly questionable social ascent, without ever bothering to hear her side of the story. Julian, though always discreet in his reactions, felt the blow in indirect ways. The criticisms aimed at Élise eventually turned on him as well. Advisors, associates, and even members of his own staff began questioning the appropriateness of their connection. He tried to downplay the damage, refusing to make public statements or justify choices he deemed too personal for the media's gaze. However, he knew that silence, as elegant as it might seem, only fueled further speculation. The mansion, which in recent months had become a space of emotional renewal and discovery, once again cloaked itself in the weight of its old walls. The spontaneity of light-hearted days with Annalena diminished. The girls' laughter still echoed in the gardens, but now with longer pauses, as if she too had sensed the change affecting the adults around her. Élise tried to maintain her routine with dignity. She continued caring for Annalena with devotion, preparing breakfast with the same gentleness, and arranging the library's books with care, but something inside her had retreated. She avoided crossing paths with the older staff, refrained from joining in small table conversations, and preferred the garden's silence to the house's murmur. The strong woman who had picked herself up so many times in life was now facing a kind of invisible pain, not caused by poverty, but by the cruelty of a society that could not tolerate someone crossing the boundaries it had imposed. The public humiliation did not stem from having been poor, but from watching the world use her simplicity as ammunition to wound her dignity. And in that suffocating atmosphere, Julian realized that the feeling he had once tried to bury beneath the surface had become clearer. The coldness he had maintained as a form of self-protection no longer served as a shield. He knew he could no longer ignore what he felt, nor the consequences it would bring. The bond between them, though still unspoken, was now marked not only by shared routines and care for his daughter, but also by the pain of facing a world that judged them for daring to be in the same place, at the same time, for reasons that went beyond social convenience. The pressure that had built up in the days following the public exposure of Elise's life reached an irreversible point. Even though she had tried to withstand the avalanche of comments and insinuations with dignity, the weight of being at the center of a collective judgment day after day began to affect her deeply. It was no longer just an external discomfort, but a wound that was silently growing within her. The house, which once symbolized a new chance, began to feel like a maze of suspicious glances, restrained footsteps, and poorly disguised whispers. No matter how hard she tried to maintain her routine, every gesture was interpreted as part of a sensationalist narrative. Her affection for Annalena, her presence beside Julian, even her way of walking through the corridors became a source of speculation. She couldn't take it anymore. It wasn't pride that guided her decision, nor a desire for punishment or a definitive break. It was the need to find her center again, far from the noise, the watchful eyes, the malice. She didn't want to see her story turned into a spectacle of mockery, nor did she want her presence to become a burden for Julian or his daughter, who had transformed so much over those past months. With a heavy heart, and her eyes fixed on the still open suitcases, Élise made the decision to return to Provence. Not because she had given up, but because she understood that she needed to step away to protect what remained of her truth. She knew that by leaving, she would leave something of herself behind in that house, something she could never take back. But she also believed that, among the lavender fields and silent hills of her homeland, she might find again the woman she was before being torn apart by the cruelty of a world that doesn't forgive those who dare to cross its invisible lines. The farewell was quiet. No dramatic scene marked her departure. Just the sound of suitcase wheels sliding across the stone floor and the echo of steady footsteps through the mansion's corridors. Annalena, though not fully understanding the reasons, sensed the absence before it was even complete. The light in the girl's eyes, which for so long reflected trust and joy during her moments with Élise, gradually dimmed. Julian, for his part, remained still in the face of the absence. He didn't try to stop her, not because he didn't want to, but because he understood that what connected him to her was too strong to be caged by convention. He respected her choice with the same silence he had long used as a shield, but inside him, something broke. Upon arriving back in Provence, Élise didn't find the same place she had left months earlier. The landscape still carried the sweet scent of lavender, and the rooftops of the houses still leaned beneath the blue sky, but something inside her had changed for good. Her return wasn't a retreat, but an attempt at reconstruction. She went back to taking care of her grandmother's house, which still held the warmth and disorder typical of old homes. Mornings were once again filled with the sound of birds, the preparation of tea, and the simple touch of sun-dried sheets. But now, Élise carried a delicate melancholy that not even the chirping of crickets at night could soften. It wasn't sadness for having left, but a deep longing for something that had touched her soul and now felt out of reach. In the days that followed, she avoided newspapers, declined calls from the agency that had hired her, and politely refused any attempts at outside contact. She wanted to immerse herself in the rhythm of the countryside, in the quiet language of the land and time. She tended to the flowers, cooked simple meals with her grandmother, and at night, wrote down small thoughts in a worn notebook she had kept since her teenage years. In it, she didn't record pain or complaints, only memories of the good moments shared with Annalena, Julian's kind gestures, and sensations she didn't want to forget. It was her way of keeping alive the most beautiful part of a story that, despite its abrupt ending, still represented one of the most authentic experiences of her life. She knew that time would bring answers. That distance, no matter how painful, would allow each of them to reflect on what truly mattered. She had no expectations or demands. She didn't want to win anything back or prove anything. She only wished to remain true to her essence, the same essence that had accompanied her from the French fields to the cold corridors of Julian's mansion. Even among cruel headlines and judgmental eyes, she had never stopped being who she was. And now, back in her refuge, she sought only the peace of a quiet new beginning, without an audience, without judgment, without armor. Élise's absence created a strange silence within the mansion in the Engadin Valley. The days, once filled with shared routines and the gentle, sensitive presence of the young Frenchwoman, once again became marked by empty, automatic gestures. Annalena was the first to show the effects of that loss. She withdrew into her room, avoided her father's eyes, and rejected the touch of the temporary nannies sent by the agency. None of them had the delicacy to listen in silence, to respect the girl's quiet moments, or to share in the care of the garden's little details. The toys that were once always scattered now remained untouched, and the drawings that once colored the corners of the house disappeared one by one, erased by the discouragement that took over the child. Annalena didn't cry like a child throwing a tantrum. She collapsed with the resignation of someone who already knew too much about loss. She would spend hours at the window, eyes fixed on the road that cut across the frost-covered field. As if at any moment, Élise might appear again, with the same light coat and serene smile she always wore when greeting her. The nights returned to silence, but not the comfortable kind of rest. They were heavy, marked by a restlessness that took hold of the house. The girl, who had once found lightness in her relationship with Élise, now seemed to lose what little balance she had left. She began to speak less, eat little, and ask to sleep with the lights on. The trust that had started to bloom wilted before anyone could stop it. Julian, for his part, sank into an even harsher silence. He made no speeches or dramatic gestures over Élise's departure. He simply withdrew. He kept following his routine with precision, attending meetings, signing documents, moving through social events with the same cold detachment as always. But something in him had changed. He began to avoid the places in the house where he used to encounter Élise, stopped going to the garden, and no longer ate in the main dining hall. He started arriving late to important commitments, became frequently distracted, forgot names, and ignored key details in negotiations. Carl Weiss, his closest advisor, noticed the growing distance but respected the space Julian had imposed on himself. He knew Julian was not a man who vented or admitted to weakness, especially not in a moment like that. Internally, Julian was fighting a battle that made it impossible to breathe freely. He tried to convince himself that everything that had happened was exaggerated, that Élise had reacted impulsively, and that her departure might have been necessary. But every attempt to rationalize his feelings fell apart when he looked into his daughter's sorrowful eyes. Élise's presence had triggered an invisible but profound change. She had revealed a side of Annalena that he, as a father, had never been able to reach on his own. She had offered the girl a kind of love that wasn't measured in gifts or assurances, but in true presence. Julian missed that more than he was willing to admit. It wasn't just longing. It was the feeling of having lost something he only realized existed when it was already too late. He tried to convince himself that normalcy would return, tried to believe that, with time, Annalena would overcome the absence and that he himself would regain his focus on business. But the days dragged on, and nothing improved. On the contrary, Élise's absence began to haunt the small details of daily life. The silence in the hallways was no longer neutral. It was suffocating. The solitary meals became unbearable. And more than anything, the lack of spontaneous laughter, of a warm and unpretentious presence, began to highlight the emptiness that reigned in both their lives. Annalena, even without words, conveyed everything with her eyes. Julian watched her trying to deal with the pain of loss in a mature way, and that silent attempt broke his heart even more. It was as if they were both trapped in the same sadness, but didn't know how to get through it together. Julian couldn't find words to comfort his daughter, nor to console himself. The coldness he had cultivated for years as a defense mechanism now prevented him from getting close. He wanted to hug Annalena, to take her to Provence, to knock on Élise's door, and ask her to come back. But he did none of that. He merely carried the weight of his own inaction, aware that by not taking a stand when it mattered most, he now bore the consequences. Pride, rigidity, and fear of scandal had cost him something that could never be replaced. And even in the face of everything he had, wealth, influence, prestige, Julian realized he was once again alone, not by choice, but by omission, and that realization haunted him with an intensity no boardroom or financial figure could silence. The days following Élise's departure continued to plunge Julian into a stifling silence, as if all the strength that had once kept him hardened against pain was slowly dissolving. Annalena remained apathetic. The household staff moved about in silence, and the professional commitments he once handled with surgical precision began to pile up. No matter how much he tried to maintain an appearance of normalcy, Julian could no longer ignore the devastating effect of Élise's absence. Every corner of the mansion held traces of her, and the lack of color, sound, and lightness began to weigh on his shoulders like lead. Loneliness was no longer a choice. It had become a punishment. It was in this context that Carl Weiss, the only person who still moved between intimacy and institutional respect, decided to intervene. By Julian's side for years, he knew the most hidden traits of the man who, behind the coldness and absolute control, carried wounds that had never fully healed. With his usual sobriety, Carl recognized that this wasn't just another moment of strategic withdrawal. Something was broken, something that had escaped Julian's rational control. And for that very reason, for the first time in a long while, Carl chose to break the silent pact that kept them at a distance when it came to personal matters. He entered the office without announcing himself, sat down in front of his friend, and did what he rarely did. He spoke firmly, looking Julian in the eye not as a subordinate, but as an equal. The intervention was unexpected. Julian didn't react right away, but he couldn't ignore it. Carl's words hit harder than he would ever admit, not because the tone was harsh or accusatory, but because they were filled with truth. Carl didn't pass judgment, nor did he offer simplistic advice. He merely reminded Julian of what he had lost in the past because of fear, pride, and hesitation. And now, with everything at stake, not just a growing feeling, but Annalina's emotional stability and the chance to build something real, Julian understood that he could no longer hide behind excuses. He realized that if he remained passive, he would let slip away the only thing that had made him feel again. The conversation was brief, but impactful. Carl left without waiting for a response. He knew Julian wasn't a man who exploded with reactions or made impulsive decisions, but he also knew his words would echo for days, maybe weeks, and that's exactly what happened. The memory of losing his wife, though long shrouded in silence, resurfaced. How he had allowed emotional distance to settle in their relationship, how grief had frozen his emotions, and how he had let time take away what could still have been saved. Now, with Élise, he felt he was on the verge of repeating the same mistake, even if the context was different, even if the intensity was new. The memory of Élise on the night of the Prague ball, in that understated dress, illuminated by its simplicity, came back vividly. The way she looked at him without expecting anything in return, how she walked beside him even knowing she would be judged, how she was fully present in Annalina's life. It was different from anything Julian had ever experienced. There was no self-interest, no strategy. There was surrender, truth, and a beauty that defied explanation. And now, all of that was hundreds of miles away. The pain of having let pride outweigh the courage to defend her gnawed at him. Julian understood that feeling wasn't enough anymore. It was time to act. From that moment on, something began to shift inside him. It wasn't a sudden outburst, but a quiet awakening. He started paying more attention to Annalina, searching in her gestures for the reflection of Elise's absence. He realized he wasn't the only one carrying that pain. The girl, with her wounded innocence, seemed to be waiting for her father to take on the role of emotional leader, something that had never been his strength. But this time, Julian felt he couldn't fail. Not for public image, not out of wounded pride, but because he had understood that letting Élise go without fighting for her would be the cruelest form of cowardice, and he had lived long enough to know the cost of regret. In the following days, Julian reorganized his schedule. He canceled commitments, postponed meetings, suspended events. He spent more time with Annalina, not to distract her, but to listen to her. The silence between them began to lose its heaviness, and small gestures of connection started to appear. The girl didn't return to smiling the way she used to, but she accepted her father's presence more often. Julian, even without knowing how to name his own feelings, allowed himself to feel. He remembered walks with Élise, the quiet breakfasts, the discreet glances that hid a budding affection. All of it began to form an inner urgency, a call to action. The silent confrontation with his own story was set. Julian understood that if he did nothing, he would lose not only the woman he had come to admire, but also the chance to rebuild a bond with his daughter. And perhaps, more importantly than anything else, he would lose himself. Carl, with few words, had pointed the way. Now it was up to Julian to decide whether he had the courage to follow it. Elise's absence hovered over the mansion like a shadow that spread slowly and silently into the corners of an empty space. The days following her departure were marked by a silence deeper than the one that existed before her arrival. The vitality she had brought with her presence, even if subtle, vanished like the breeze retreating at dusk. Annalina, who used to spend hours by Elise's side drawing, watering plants, or simply walking under the gray sky of the valley, now withdrew again into the quiet shell that had characterized her early days. Her eyes lost their shine, and the delicate routine of affection built with so much care fell apart like the dried petals of a forgotten bouquet. Julian noticed the changes but found no way to fill them. For the first time in a long while, he recognized his own helplessness in the face of emotional pain that could not be solved with orders, contracts, or control. He saw his daughter suffer, saw absence filling spaces once full of life, but also recognized, with an uncomfortable tightness in his chest, that the pain keeping him up at night came from somewhere else, from missing Élise. That emotional discomfort, initially denied, turned into constant unrest. Julian became less productive, less present in business decisions, and less rigid in his routines. Something inside him was fighting against the very structure he had built over the years. It was during one of those sleepless nights, while staring at the starry sky through the wide window of his office, that he understood he wasn't just missing the employee who had said goodbye so discreetly. What consumed him was the absence of the woman who, even in silence, made him feel seen, understood, and above all, human. Élise's presence had softened his days and opened a crack in his emotional armor. With her, he had laughed without realizing, listened without hurry, and without planning, allowed affection to settle inside him with a naturalness that frightened him. And now, with her gone, all that remained was a void that even the most productive days couldn't fill. That's when he made his decision. He could no longer ignore what he felt. He prepared for a trip he never would have predicted in his usual plans. He informed his close circle that he would be away for a few days, citing a personal need, something unheard of for someone so methodical. He took Annalena with him, understanding that she too needed a reunion. He didn't plan any speeches, nor any strategies. He just knew he needed to see her. They set off for Provence, where the fields were beginning to bloom again, signaling the end of winter and the start of a new season. During the journey, Julian remained silent, but his expression said more than words could explain. He was nervous, restrained, consumed by an anxiety he hadn't felt since his youth. When they arrived at the village, the contrast between the harsh cold of Engadine and the warm embrace of Provence was immediate. The cobblestone streets, ivy-covered walls, and the scent of wildflowers drifting through narrow alleys triggered fresh memories for Annalena. She recognized the path, and suddenly let go of her father's hand and ran through the central square. Julian barely had time to react. When he caught up with her, he saw his daughter tightly hugging a figure simply dressed, holding a bag of fresh fruit. It was Élise, her hair pulled into a quick bun, wearing a dress with a light hint of lavender. Time seemed to suspend itself right then. The emotion on the girl's face shattered the silence like a cry of truth no one could deny. Julian stood a few steps away, watching the scene with tearful eyes. He felt vulnerable and, at the same time, incredibly alive. The woman who had stayed strong amid the coldness of his home was now standing before him, and nothing else seemed to matter. Not the scandal, not the media, not the judgments. Only her. He approached cautiously, not as the businessman used to controlling everything, but as someone who had finally acknowledged his fragility. His heart pounded irregularly as his feet touched the dry village square. When he finally stood before Élise, he didn't seek justification or excuses. He simply met her eyes, finding in them the reflection of what he had been trying to understand ever since she left. Annalena's presence made that reunion even more powerful. The girl, with her spontaneous hug and emotional gaze, seemed to seal something that words still hesitated to express. Élise, surprised and visibly moved, dropped the bags to the ground. Her eyes welled up when she saw Julian standing there, vulnerable, unarmed. Then he, with a trembling but steady voice, spoke the words that freed everything he had tried to hide for months. He said he hadn't come just to bring her back as an employee. He was there because he realized his life had lost its meaning without her. He didn't speak as a boss or a powerful man. He spoke as someone who, at last, had chosen love, chosen to stop running. The square, silent yet full of life, bore witness to what would become the beginning of everything. There, among spilled fruit and the scent of flowers, between ancient stones that told the stories of generations, two worlds finally recognized each other, no longer as opposites, but as complements. The reunion needed no promises or grand gestures, just the sincerity in their eyes, the silent affection of a child, and the courage of a man admitting that to love is, above all, to allow oneself to feel. Julian and Annalena's arrival in Provence wasn't just a geographical return, but the resumption of something deeper, a bond that had been wounded, but not broken. The reconciliation, sealed between the scent of lavender and the restrained emotion of their reunion, didn't erase the scars of the recent past. On the contrary, it revealed wounds that needed time and truth to heal. Élise, now firmer in her convictions, made it clear she didn't want to return to the mansion in the Engadine Valley, not out of fear or pride, but because she had come to understand that the life Julian led there no longer aligned with her values. She valued simplicity, presence, the daily building of emotional connection, and she didn't want to be dragged back into a world of appearances, protocols, and stifling silence. Julian, faced with this, didn't argue. He didn't try to persuade her with empty promises or with the power he had always used to fix everything around him. He simply listened, and for the first time, he understood the weight of what she was saying and the depth of what she felt. In the days that followed, Julian stayed in the village alongside Élise and his daughter, closely observing how life there flowed with a more natural rhythm. Unlike the rigidity he had built in the Alps, Provence revealed a vibrant routine, made up of familiar faces, small gestures of solidarity, and spontaneous encounters. Julian realized how much he had become a prisoner of the image he projected to the world: the successful businessman, the impeccable father, the resilient widower. With Élise, he felt human again, allowed to make mistakes, to doubt, to fear, and to genuinely desire a fresh start. It was in that setting that an idea began to take shape. Instead of trying to fit Élise into his world, he decided to transform his world to welcome what she represented. Julian remembered an old hotel that had belonged to his mother's family, located in a mountainous region on the border between Austria and Slovenia. The place, closed for decades and surrounded by woods and crystal-clear streams, had once been a refuge and a site of contemplation during the summers of his youth. The property, forgotten by the family since the passing of his grandmother, remained structurally sound, though overgrown with weeds, dampness, and nostalgia. In that silent building, he saw an opportunity not only to rescue something of sentimental value, but to give new purpose to his own journey. With the resources he had and the knowledge he had accumulated over the years, he could transform that space into something much more than a business. He could turn it into a true and symbolic shelter. He proposed to Élise that they join forces to breathe new life into the place, converting it into a center of support for women in vulnerable situations and mothers with young children in need of immediate help. The project wouldn't be just philanthropic. It would be visceral. When Élise heard the proposal, she saw a sincere light in Julian's eyes, stripped of the coldness that once defined him. It was no longer about impressing her or winning her back. It was a gesture of surrender, of personal transformation, of empathy born from shared life and deep listening. She accepted with quiet enthusiasm, moved yet cautious. She knew that changing external structures was easier than changing internal patterns. Even so, she was willing to try, because she saw in him the effort of someone who truly wanted to become better, not just for himself, but for the world around him. The following months were marked by hard work, shared decisions, and emotional reconnections. The property underwent significant but respectful renovations that honored the original architecture. The stone facades were cleaned and restored. The rooms received fresh colors and creatively repurposed furnishings. They created common areas for community gatherings, reading rooms, small workshops, and open gardens. Around the building, an orchard was replanted, vegetable gardens emerged, and the local community was involved in the restoration. Villagers, former residents, and local artisans joined the couple in their efforts, strengthening ties to the land and the people. For the first time, Julian gave up his formal attire in daily life and began cultivating a simpler way of living, though deeply committed. Annalena, in turn, blossomed. The girl who once hid behind silence and empty gazes began attending a bilingual school in the village and quickly made friends. She participated in activities with the children being supported by the center and became increasingly open, sweet, and confident. Her bond with Élise deepened even further, not just as a caregiver now, but as a fully established maternal presence. Julian watched everything with a calm sense of emotion. He knew he had made mistakes in the past, that his rigidity and fear had kept him from many possibilities, but he also knew there was still time to rebuild, and that love, when true, doesn't impose, it transforms. Over time, Élise took on direct coordination of the house's operations, organizing teams, personally welcoming the women who arrived, listening to their stories, offering the kind of care and attention she herself had once wished to find in difficult moments. Her experience as a caregiving granddaughter and nanny now blended with the maturity of someone who knew the value of every small gesture. Julian handled the administrative side, but made a point of also being present in daily life. He frequently prepared breakfast, joined the children on short nature outings, and always kept the office door open, ready to talk to anyone in need. What had once been an empire of control was now a space of welcome. Together, side by side, they learned that the most lasting kind of love doesn't come from grand promises or performative gestures, but from daily choices, mutual respect, and the ongoing decision to stay. And even though they had not returned to the conventional format of an idealized family, they had built something even rarer, a shared life project that made sense not only to them, but to those whose lives they touched. The old hotel, now reborn with purpose and affection, had become a symbol of what they had built together. Not just a new home, but a new path. Time passed with the gentleness of the changing seasons, each transition marked with quiet grace. The old mountain property, which had once held Julian's childhood summers and was later revived alongside Élise, became a true refuge for women and children seeking a new beginning. The foundation gained international recognition for its social and humanitarian impact, but for Élise and Julian, the greatest reward lay in the smiles that crossed the home's hallways, in the shared lunches in the garden, in the stories told by the fireplace, and in the cold mornings that now began with laughter instead of silence. The greatness of the project wasn't measured by numbers or awards, but by the consistency with which hope was restored in every face that arrived exhausted and left transformed. Élise, with her firm serenity and welcoming presence, became a living symbol of balance, and Julian, by her side, learned to value the quiet victories, the ones born from daily affection and genuine listening. The couple's routine no longer relied on the aristocratic conventions that once dictated their every step. They lived simply, without giving up the beauty of the small rituals they had built together. Mornings began with fresh bread, fruit picked from the orchard, and the smell of coffee drifting across the porch. Annalena, now older and completely transformed, had become the constant joy of the house. Her once contained energy now overflowed in invented songs, paintings scattered across the walls of the children's art studio, and long walks through the fields surrounding the foundation. The little girl felt part of something greater than a family. She was part of a purpose, and her bond with Élise, strengthened by genuine coexistence and unconditional love, grew more solid, affectionate, and spontaneous with each passing day. Julian, once accustomed to leading with rigidity and distance, learned to follow the rhythm of the days with more ease. He accepted that absolute control didn't offer true security, and that the risk of living fully was worth more than any emotional shield. He allowed himself to be moved by the stories of the women they welcomed, by the strength of the mothers starting over with what little they had, and by Elise's gaze, which never demanded perfection from him, but inspired him daily to be more genuine. Their love was no longer based on grand gestures, but on the quiet companionship of days shared with dignity and meaning. The foundation grew organically. New wings were opened with the support of partners committed to the cause, and the project inspired similar initiatives in other countries. The support network strengthened without losing the original home's familiar essence. Élise made a point of preserving the intimate, welcoming atmosphere of the first house. She refused to let institutional growth swallow the project's spirit. Everything continued to be lived with their feet on the ground and hearts wide open. The gardens bloomed, the seasons completed their cycles, and life pulsed strongly in the small, constant choices. On a golden late afternoon, as the surrounding fields were painted with copper tones and a gentle breeze rustled the branches of freshly blossomed lavender, a new scene emerged on the horizon of the story they had built. Élise, with her hair simply tied back and a loose white dress flowing over her already rounded belly, walked slowly between the rows of flowers. Her face, bathed in the soft evening light, reflected fullness. Not just because she was pregnant, but because she knew that every step of that moment carried the weight and grace of all they had overcome to get there. Julian, a few steps behind, watched her silently, feeling his chest tighten with a tenderness that no longer felt foreign. As he approached, he wrapped her in a calm embrace, resting his hands over the belly that carried the new life they were expecting. Annalena's presence completed the scene with spontaneity. She picked small wildflowers and softly sang a melody she had learned from one of the mothers at the house. The little girl no longer feared emptiness or absence. She felt whole there, among two adults who had chosen not only to love each other, but to build a structure where she could grow with safety and freedom. Julian, with a steady and serene gaze, let the words flow simply, without rehearsals, without defenses, just as he had learned from Élise, that they hadn't simply formed a family, they had built a true home, a home made of listening, respect, imperfection, forgiveness, and real love. And there, under the softly orange sky of Provence, among flowers and lived promises, the silence that enveloped them didn't mean absence, it meant presence. Their story didn't end there, nor did it begin again. It simply continued, with the same organic rhythm as the vineyards, the wind, and the life that insisted on being reborn, whenever the heart chose with honesty. Not long after, on a quiet afternoon with clear skies and mild air, the old bell of the abandoned cathedral rang once more, not for any ecclesiastical obligation, but for a call born from memory and affection. It was there, in that temple of weathered stones and dusty stained glass, that Julian and Élise had first exchanged a glance that would forever change the course of their lives. And it was there, too, where the heavy silences of a wounded soul once lingered, that they now celebrated a new beginning, not with grandeur, not with noble guests or promises made under the world's spotlight, but with the serene dignity that only true intimacy can offer. The cathedral, delicately restored by anonymous volunteer hands, carried within its walls an almost sacred atmosphere, not because of the ceremonies it once hosted, but because of the symbolic strength of blessing the present of two people who had rebuilt their foundations upon the ruins of suffering. The ceremony didn't follow traditional rites. There was no priest, no choir, no lavish rings. Only the natural sounds from outside, the birds singing over the rooftop, the soft wind passing through the stained glass, the murmur of Annalina's footsteps over the restored marble. She carried in her hands a small bouquet picked from the foundation's garden, with lavender, daisies, and a few wildflowers tied together with a white ribbon. Her hair was loose, and her light dress danced with the breeze flowing through the open nave. She walked between the wooden pews, with the lightness of someone who understood that the moment was greater than any celebration. It was the consecration of the love that had restored her childhood. Julian and Élise entered together, side by side, with calm steps and eyes locked on each other. They carried no embellishments, no prepared speeches. They walked as they had walked to that point, aware of their scars, firm in their choice to stay, grateful for what they had built together. Élise wore a cream linen dress, hand-embroidered by the women of the foundation. Her already rounded belly was clearly visible beneath the fabric, revealing that a new chapter was already beating there, within reach of their hearts. Julian, in a grayish-blue suit and a light cotton tie, wore a discreet smile, one not forced to please, but born from a soul at peace. The altar displayed no golden crosses or sacred images, only an arrangement of wildflowers and a frame holding a watercolor painted by Annalina. On the canvas, 3 figures walked hand in hand toward a field of flowers under a clear sky with small pink clouds. It was a child's translation of all they had lived through, captured by someone who had learned to turn pain into tenderness. Julian and Élise stopped in front of the painting as if they were facing the purest truth, and they remained there for a few silent minutes. It was a gesture of gratitude, recognition, and reverence for all they had overcome. Karl Weiss, who had come especially from Austria for that intimate celebration, watched everything seated in the last pew. The old advisor, once preoccupied with strategies, numbers, and reputations, was now moved by the simplicity of that union. Over time, he had come to understand that a man's true legacy is not measured by the properties he owns, but by the integrity of the relationships he builds. And in that moment, he saw that Julian had not only won the love of a woman, but had also reconciled with his own humanity. The ceremony unfolded with small gestures, a glance exchanged between Élise and Annalina, Julian's hand resting gently on his beloved's belly, and a soft kiss sealing the silent pact they had kept since the first moment they chose to walk together. After that, they left the cathedral in silence, under the golden light of the evening. There was no crowd waiting, no flashing cameras or headlines, only nature celebrating, trees dancing with the wind, sunflowers tilting toward the setting sun, and cicadas singing the song that marked the end of one cycle and the beginning of another. In the days that followed, life returned to its peaceful rhythm. The foundation gained a new wing dedicated to caring for pregnant women in vulnerable situations. Élise coordinated the care with the sensitivity of someone who knew both fear and hope. Julian supported every decision with steady calm, not needing to be the protagonist, but always present, available, and wholehearted. Annalena helped with the house activities, read stories to the children staying at the foundation, and painted on the walls of the hall where communal meals were held. It was evident in every corner of that property that love had planted deep roots. In the final scene of the story, a sunny morning bathed the fields in a soft glow. Élise walked slowly through the orchard, now in the final days of her pregnancy. Her hair braided, her skin radiant under the Provence sun, and her bare feet on the damp earth composed an image of fulfillment. Julian, following close behind with a basket of fruit, paused to watch her in silence. There was no rush, no anxiety, only time stretched gently over them like a soft blanket. As he approached, he placed his hand on her shoulder and smiled, letting the moment speak for itself. They had not just built a family, they had built a home, where affections were tended like flowers in fertile soil, where pain had room to heal, and where bonds were born not from obligation, but from the daily choice to stay. And so, in the heart of Provence, under the natural light of true love, their story found its resting place, not as a final period, but as the continuous breath of a life lived with courage, surrender, and meaning. True love does not ask for permission, nor does it impose itself. It arrives when the heart is ready to begin again, not to relive the past, but to build, brick by brick, what can still bloom. Because homes are not born ready, they are made of the people who choose to stay.